Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. This is the France 24 debate. We're discussing hunger in the Horn of Africa. We're talking about it with David Orr of the World Food Programme, who joins us from Nairobi. François Danel, Executive Director of aid agency Action Against Hunger. François Ndengwe of the African Advisory Board. From London, Jonathan Glennie, author of The Trouble with Aid, Why Less Could Mean More for Africa. And from Conakry, Emmanuel Goujon, until very recently the Addis Ababa bureau chief for the French news agency AFP, who is now working for the consultancy Africa Global Approach. Now, 100 million people live in the Horn of Africa and are affected by this drought. 85 million of those live, by the way, not in Somalia, but in Ethiopia, as illustrated in this graph, courtesy of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. You can see some of the areas that are hardest hit. And some of the areas, the ones that are in sort of, where you see sort of the dots, are areas where what Emmanuel Goujon was alluding to in part one, where it's difficult to go, especially the Ogaden region in right there near the Somali border. Let me ask you this question again, Emmanuel Goujon. Is it the same situation on both sides of the border, where politics and security are the reason behind the hunger?
There is a lot of insecurity. As I said again, there are a problem of climate, problem of lack of rains and things like that in this area, especially in Ogaden regions in the lowlands of Ethiopia, which is very different from the islands where the water is normally enough. But in these lowlands of Ogaden, you have for a very long time, since the mid-80s, a rebel movement named the Ogaden National Liberation Front, which the government is fighting with some troops and some soldiers and police operations on the ground in order to get rid of this rebel movement. Also, the Ethiopian army is deployed along the border with Somalia since its military operation against the Al-Shabaab 3 years ago. And so for these reasons, this region is very insecure still. And the ONLF, the rebel movement, is also organizing some operations, forcing the population to displace itself. The government on its part is regrouping some civilians in order for them not to be able to support the rebels. And so this, again, disruption of the traditional network of food distribution, cattle herding and things like that, are posing a big problem for the food safety in the whole region. So the situation is not really the same, but again, in this part of Ethiopia, insecurity is an aggravating factor.
François Danel, how do you advise on food policy in a situation such as the one Emmanuel Goujon just described?
How we could do with the food policy, you say? Really, we have to face first the emergency, and then it's again a political issue, and how to have a better governance and a better security, and to be able to plan to have this type of program that we were talking about, these safety nets. But to have all of these prevention program, you have to have a stable government, a stable organization to make some planification and some prevention.
Jonathan Glennie, fair point that you have to distinguish between an emergency and long-term policy?
Of course. I mean, when there's a humanitarian crisis, the first thing you need to do is to just get everyone together and see what can be done to help. But in the long term, one has to recognize that even emergency responses have impacts over the future development of a country. And one of the problems we've had over the last 20 or 30 years is the way that long-term development aid, as opposed to humanitarian aid, has been spent, has been in such a way as to undermine the long-term development of institutions. And institutions are absolutely crucial to respond to these kind of emergencies. But we've seen the undermining of institutions rather than the building them up. And I think that is beginning to change as donors begin to understand the importance of accountability of institutions to citizens. And that's something that hopefully we'll see in the next decade.
When you say the undermining of institutions, what do you mean?
A lot of countries in Africa, and Ethiopia is one of them, have been reliant on aid for a large part of their GDP for the last 2 to 3 decades. Now, I wrote a book called, Less Aid Could Be Better for Africa, not because I'm against aid, but because I think it's important to recognise that aid dependency is a factor that has to be taken into account. A lot of countries are beginning to set out a future without aid because they recognise that relying on external funds in the long term undermines the development, the very development that they seek. There's constant need for emergency funds, yes, but at some stage the funds have to be built up domestically, and the policies have to be gotten right domestically.
David Orr, your thoughts on that? When you go into an area where there's an emergency, do you fear that you may be tipping the scales of the local economy?
Well, as your correspondent said, when there's an emergency, I mean, I think you've just got to react immediately. I mean, obviously, these are things we look at. We work very closely with governments, with our partners on the ground to make sure that we contribute rather than detract from the situation. More and more, I think WFP, and I'd say that's probably true of most UN agencies, are actually trying to put in place systems that bolster the local economy by, for example, purchasing from local smallholders rather than bringing in aid, or at least where possible to purchase from local smallholders rather than bringing all the aid in from the exterior.
And is that a new policy, something that's only happened in recent times, David Orr? Excuse me.
People's resilience to climatic and other shocks, this kind of thing. Yeah, I mean, it's something we've got to keep a very, very close eye on all the time.
I was going to ask you, David Orr, is that a new policy? How new is that policy?
I think it's a trend over the last number of years, particularly over the last decade, that the aid community is becoming more aware of its of the sensitivity of the environments into which it goes, and how it must work more closely with the local people, not just to produce an immediate solution to a problem, but a more long-term, sustainable solution. And yeah, we see this particularly in some of the drought-affected areas of the Horn of Africa. It's not perfect, but I've certainly visited some areas, for example, where we're helping people to build dams, water harvesting facilities, that kind of thing, just so they have a sort of longer-term ability to cope with the particularly harsh conditions of living in this region.
François Ndengwe, when you think back to a quarter century ago, when there was the Live Aid concert in 1985 to raise money to stop famine in Ethiopia, at the time, what did you think about these concerts, and what do you think has been the result of them over the long period?
The result had not been really lasting ones, so to say the less. And if we see it, your question is very important, and if you look at the question with the issue of aid, on long-term results of aid, you know that even the donors, the so-called donors community, they've seen that the aid was not that efficient. That's why in 2001 they had what they called the Paris Declaration of Aid Effectiveness. And then after some 2 or 3 years later, they had also a meeting of the donors community in Accra, Ghana, on the aid effectiveness. And this year, at the end of this year, in South Korea, they will have a major donors meeting again on aid effectiveness. So these people, they have been talking on aid effectiveness, but in Africa, we're not seeing results. We at African Advisory Board, we've devised a tool that we call GORA, Goal Rating Agency, which is a tool that could measure the effectiveness of aids. And for this, we have a number of indicators. I can just cite 3. For this to be efficient, you have to see if on the ground, this aid will indeed delivers. You see it through how the people are organized, what is the manpower, and what are the resources. Are these resources being used for the result that is announced? And if you come back to the question of Somalia here, I think we're facing really some dramatic events, what is happening nowadays. You've just seen this militia parading. So I think what we just have to ask the Somalian people themselves, what do you want? Do you want to continue wars like this? Could these dramatic events of these days be a triggering point to see that, we've descended too much in the bottom of the hell? So this is the moment where all the people of Somalia can come, because this is a security, this is a military problem with needing a political solution.
And when you hear that the Al-Shabaab militia are now saying, please come in for the first time in 2 years?
They must go further than that. It's not that we just because they were drawn, please coming from 2 months for 2 months or 3 months. Then we will start fighting each other and killing each other again. And we can see the problem more globally. You know that this region is part of the. They've just 2 months ago there was a meeting with the SADC region and the East African community to form a common policy and a common monetary system, something like common market. So I think this is the responsibility, first of all, of the people of Somalia, and then of the sub-region there, going from SADC to East African community. And we can even look at the problem more largely. This is a problem of the African Union. This head of state, they've met just 1 or 2 weeks ago. They had a huge meeting in Malabo, Guinea, of the African head of states. You haven't heard about the issue of agriculture. Are they paying enough attention to agriculture? So they have to, at the level of the African Union, we have to take this problem seriously. And don't think that even the Al-Shabaab, they're powerful enough to prevent people from taking a solution. We are facing really dramatic situation. This should be a triggering point to say, oh, we've done too bad. Let us start anew.
François Danel, your reaction?
Yes, you're right, but we cannot take in hostage the children and the women. So you're right that it should be a new point to start a peaceful country and something which is sustainable. But there is an emergency for the children and the women, and they cannot be the price to pay for this new deal and this new policy. So we have to do both, to intervene in the emergency and to build the future, as you just said.
Yes, there is no contradiction
Yeah.
with what you just said. I'm just saying this should be a great moment for people to take conscience, to say, oh, we've been very bad in dealing with our problems. This is the time to come together and solve. Africa is if you look at the figures in terms of arable land, you know that Africa is a huge continent. You don't have drought all over the places, even in Kenya there. So Africa is something like 30 million square kilometers. The US is 9 and China at 9. And even if you take the arable land, you have in Africa something like 8% of African land is arable. Even that, if you make the calculation, you still have, in terms of arable land, much more arable land in Africa than in the US and China combined. This means that you have the possibility to grow food. You have the possibility to produce food. And then you need the distribution to distribute to places where there are drought. Even here in France, you see what you're having drought in France now. But the farmers, they've been helped by the government. They're moving food and things from one places to another through the train. So this is the type of problems that the African Union, in terms of investment, and the so-called donor community can say, because we need long-term solutions to problems that could be very solved.
David Orr, when you say you were in Somalia a couple of weeks ago, when you go to Nairobi, when you go to other parts of Africa, listening to what François Ndengwe says about how there's plenty of places you can grow food, even in the Horn of Africa. When you go to other places, do you say to yourself, come on, why are these people still importing food in some parts?
I think, Africa, it's a very diverse continent, obviously, and people face different challenges in different areas. I mean, traditionally, I suppose you could say that poor access to markets, for example, has been a big problem for a lot of African farmers. They just haven't had the road infrastructure and that sort of thing. And that's changing, and I think that's something that the international community and donors will have to pay a lot of attention to, is just really helping these people in these communities develop their access, develop their assets, so that they can produce better crops. They have better seeds, for example, that are maybe disease resistant, drought resistant. That's something obviously that is going to have to be looked at. There is the technology out there. Obviously, there's a lot to consider. Some African countries, for example, will favor genetically modified crops. Others will not. We, as an agency in WFP, obviously respect what the governments decide on that particular issue, but these are all things that have to be looked at. And yeah, there are some parts of this continent you travel around and you go to somewhere like Zimbabwe, or people think this is a totally blighted land, and then you go there and you see this wonderfully rolling landscape with some very lush farmland, but they've also had their problems with droughts and a very complex political situation thrown into the bargain.
Sure.
So, yeah, there are so many variables.
I just want to point out a comment on the France 24 Debate Facebook page. Vic writes the following. He's worried about donation fatigue. We don't know who to donate to anymore. There are local needs, and we can only give this much in this world of financial crises. People are tired of Africans not using their fishing rods, but rather waiting for someone to donate to them yet again another fish. Jonathan Glennie, what can you tell Vic as far as, is the situation getting any better on that score?
Well, I agree with quite a lot of what your panelists have said. I actually slightly disagree with the continued negativity. And in fact, what Mr. Orr was saying just now, I think was more spot on. Was he called Vic, the guy that wrote in?
Yes.
Actually, things are getting better in Africa, and that's why this particular focus on this, what is an absolute disaster, needs to be put in context. It was just last week, I think, or the previous week, that Ghana and Zambia, two very poor countries, were declared middle-income countries. That's the 28th middle-income country to be declared in the last 10 years, and a lot of them have come from Africa. Everything's relative. Things are really tough. But even Ethiopia is on track for quite a lot of the Millennium Development Goals. It should be going faster. Everything could be better. But compared with the 80s, compare where things went worse, compare with the 90s where things stagnated, the last decade has been a good decade for most countries in Africa, relatively speaking. And I think that's partly because the aid community has changed the way it's operated. We've heard about different ways of supporting agriculture. Those are the kind of things that would have been very hard to get through in the 80s and 90s, when there was a very kind of private sector, ideological focus on the private sector. And the private sector is absolutely vital to make development happen. But just to focus on the market rather than the state was a mistake, and that's beginning to change as well. There's a more heterodox approach to economics, and countries are able to try new things, including subsidising small farmers. Again, something that only a few years ago you might have heard people say, that's not going to work, let's go for mega plantations rather than supporting small farmers. Well, actually, food security depends on small farmers. And I think that in the future, one of the things we're going to have to especially keep our eye on is this what's known as the scramble for Africa. Africa is full of resources, from food to oil to other resources, and people will have to keep an eye on larger powers continuing to abuse rather weaker ones in Africa.
A delicate blend needed there. I want to thank you, Jonathan Glennie, for joining us from London. I want to thank Emmanuel Goujon in Conakry, David Orr in Nairobi, François in Dengwe, and François Danel for joining us. And thank you for being with us here for the France 24 debate.